The summer of 1975 hangs heavy over San Francisco like a velvet curtain painted in shades of rebellion and tradition. Golden Gate Park stretches endlessly under a hazy California sun, where the last remnants of flower power cling to the eucalyptus trees like morning fog that refuses to lift. The air carries the mingled scents of patchouli oil, fresh sourdough bread from North Beach, and the salt-tinged breeze rolling in from the Pacific. Two worlds exist in this city by the bay, separated not by geography but by ideology, each as rigid in their beliefs as the Victorian houses that line the steep streets. On one side stand the Montagues, children of the counterculture revolution, their long hair flowing like banners of freedom, their tie-dyed clothing a testament to their rejection of conventional society. They inhabit the lower HAIGHT, where psychedelic murals bloom across building walls like wild flowers, and where the sound of acoustic guitars drifts from open windows into streets filled with the smoke of incense and something earthier. Their patriarch, Richard Montague, once wore three-piece suits and carried a briefcase to his law firm downtown. But the changing tides of the 60s swept him into a different current. Now, his graying hair falls past his shoulders, and he speaks of consciousness expansion and universal love while managing a collective of organic farms that supply the city's growing network of health food stores. His followers see him as a visionary. His enemies call him a dangerous radical who corrupts the youth with promises of a world without rules. Across the cultural divide stand the Capulets, pillars of San Francisco's established order. Vincent Capulet built his empire during the post-war boom, transforming himself from the son of Italian immigrants into one of the city's most powerful real estate developers. His suits are perfectly tailored, his silver hair meticulously groomed, and his office occupies the top floor of one of the gleaming towers that pierce the city's skyline like steel monuments to capitalism. He sees the counterculture movement as a cancer eating away at the fabric of American society, a collection of lazy dreamers and dangerous anarchists who threaten everything his generation fought to build. The feud between these families began not with violence, but with vision. 3 years earlier, the Montagues led a protest against one of Capulet's development projects, a plan to raze several blocks of historic Victorian homes to make way for a shopping complex. What started as peaceful demonstrations escalated when Capulet hired security firms to break up the protests. Images of long-haired young people being dragged away by men in suits appeared on the evening news, and the battle lines were drawn in the court of public opinion. Since then, every city council meeting becomes a battlefield where the two factions clash over the soul of San Francisco. The Montagues fight for preservation, for green spaces, for the right of alternative communities to exist without persecution. The Capulets push for progress, for economic growth, for the kind of development that brings jobs and tax revenue. Neither side can see beyond their own righteousness to find common ground. On this particular morning, as the fog begins its retreat toward the ocean, Romeo Montague walks through the Mission District with the easy stride of someone who belongs to the streets themselves. At 21, he carries his father's idealism, but tempers it with a gentleness that sets him apart from the more radical elements of the movement. His dark hair falls in waves to his shoulders, and his clothes, faded jeans, a hand-embroidered vest over a white cotton shirt, speak of someone who has found his own way to express his beliefs without shouting them from rooftops. Romeo's footsteps echo softly against the cracked sidewalks of 24th Street, where murals depicting Aztec warriors and revolutionary heroes watch over taco trucks and botanicas, filled with candles that promise love, luck, and protection from enemies. The morning sun filters through the marine layer, casting everything in soft, diffused light that makes the city look like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. He stops at a corner cafe where the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans mingles with the sweet smoke of clove cigarettes. The establishment bears all the hallmarks of the counterculture. Mismatched furniture rescued from thrift stores, macrame plant hangers suspended from exposed ceiling beams, and walls covered with concert posters, announcing performances by bands whose names sound like incantations: Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Country Joe and the Fish. Behind the counter stands Benvolio, Romeo's cousin and closest friend, his sandy hair tied back with a leather cord as he operates the gleaming espresso machine with the precision of a craftsman. At 23, Benvolio serves as the voice of reason in a family sometimes carried away by its own passionate convictions. He looks up as Romeo enters, noting the distant expression that has become increasingly common in his cousin's eyes. You're walking in circles again, Benvolio observes, pulling shots of espresso into small ceramic cups painted with peace symbols and flowers. That's the third time this week you've wandered in here looking like you've lost something but can't remember what it was. Romeo settles onto a velvet cushion salvaged from some long-dead Victorian parlor, accepting the coffee with hands that seem to carry more weight than the simple ceramic cup requires. Around them, the cafe fills with the usual morning crowd. Art students from the nearby colleges sketching in bound journals, musicians tuning guitars for impromptu sessions, writers hunched over typewriters that clack out the rhythm of poems about social revolution and spiritual awakening. Maybe I have lost something, Romeo replies, his voice carrying the soft introspection that marks him as different from his more politically radical cousins. I watch everyone around me fighting so hard for their beliefs, and I understand why the fight matters. But sometimes I wonder if we're so busy opposing their world that we forget to build our own. The conversation drifts as conversations do in places where time moves differently than in the corporate towers downtown. They speak of music, of the upcoming hardly strictly bluegrass festival in the park, of rumors that the city council plans to crack down on the communes operating in the outer neighborhoods. But underneath Romeo's words runs an undercurrent of restlessness, a sense that he's waiting for something he can't yet name. Meanwhile, across the city in the refined heights of Pacific Heights, Juliet Capulet sits in her family's sprawling Victorian mansion, its bay windows offering commanding views of the city below and the bay beyond. At 19, she possesses a beauty that seems almost anachronistic in an age of radical informality. Her dark hair falls in carefully styled waves, and her clothing, while fashionable, maintains an elegance that speaks of family expectations and social position. The house around her represents everything her father has achieved in his climb from immigrant poverty to establishment success. Persian rugs cover gleaming hardwood floors, and oil paintings in gilded frames depict pastoral scenes that bear no resemblance to the urban reality outside. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on walls painted in colors that speak of restraint and good taste. But Juliet feels like a prisoner in this museum of respectability. From her window, she can see the city spreading out below like a vast living organism, and she knows that somewhere in those streets exists a world her family has taught her to fear, but which calls to her with increasing insistence. She reads books her parents haven't approved, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, Allen Ginsberg's poetry, articles about the civil rights movement and women's liberation that she smuggles home hidden inside fashion magazines. Her closest companion is her nurse, Maria Gonzalez, a woman who came to work for the Capulet family as a young immigrant and who has watched Juliet grow from a curious child into a young woman struggling against the constraints of her privileged upbringing. Maria understands the weight of family expectations, having sacrificed her own dreams to provide for her children, but she also recognizes in Juliet a spirit too vibrant to be contained by social conventions. The afternoon sun climbs higher over San Francisco, and with it rises the tension that has been simmering between the two factions like heat waves rising from summer pavement. In the offices of Capulet Development Corporation, housed in a glass tower that reflects the city's skyline like a chrome mirror, Vincent Capulet reviews architectural plans spread across a mahogany conference table that cost more than most families earn in a year. The blueprints detail his most ambitious project yet, a massive commercial complex that would transform a section of the lower HAIGHT into a shrine to consumer capitalism. Shopping centers, office buildings, and luxury condominiums would rise where Victorian houses now shelter communes and collectives. To Vincent, this represents progress, the natural evolution of a city that must adapt or die in the competitive landscape of American business. But he knows the Montagues will fight him with every legal and publicity tool at their disposal. They've already begun organizing protests, filing environmental impact lawsuits, and rallying support from preservationist groups across the city. The local newspapers, always hungry for stories that pit the establishment against the counterculture, fan the flames with headlines that paint the conflict in stark terms of tradition versus transformation. Vincent's assistant enters with updates from the Planning Commission, and the news is not encouraging. Several city council members who previously supported development projects have begun wavering under pressure from constituent groups. The mayor, always sensitive to political winds, has called for community dialogue, a phrase that makes Vincent's jaw tighten with frustration. They don't understand, he tells his reflection in the office window. the city spreading below him like a game board where he spent decades learning to play. They think their flower power and peace signs can stop the future. But progress doesn't wait for dreamers to catch up. Meanwhile, in the converted warehouse that serves as headquarters for the Montague Collective, Richard Montague addresses a gathering of supporters whose ages span from teenagers to grandparents who remember the labor movements of the 30s. The space buzzes with passionate conversation, plans for peaceful demonstrations, strategies for legal challenges, and discussions of how to frame their message for maximum media impact. Richard stands before a hand-painted banner that reads, "Save Our City," in flowing letters surrounded by images of flowers and doves. His voice carries the conviction of someone who has traded financial security for moral certainty, and his words resonate with people who see this fight as more than a zoning dispute. "This isn't about stopping progress," he explains to the assembled crowd, his hands gesturing toward maps of the contested neighborhood. "It's about defining what progress means in a city that has always been a beacon for people seeking alternative ways to live. When we tear down the places where community has taken root, we don't just destroy buildings. We destroy the possibility that different kinds of people can coexist in the same city." The meeting continues as such meetings do, with passionate speeches and careful planning. But underneath the organized opposition flows an undercurrent of something more personal. This battle has become about more than real estate development. It has become a proxy war for competing visions of what America should become in the aftermath of the turbulent 60s. As evening approaches, fate begins weaving its invisible threads through the lives of young people who have no idea they're about to become part of a story larger than their individual desires. Juliet Capulet convinces her parents to let her attend a charity fundraiser at the De Young Museum, an event safe enough for a young woman of her social standing, cultural enough to satisfy her family's expectations of proper behavior. But the museum, like everything else in San Francisco during this era, cannot completely separate itself from the political currents flowing through the city. The fundraiser, ostensibly for children's literacy programs, attracts donors from across the social spectrum, including some progressive philanthropists who move comfortably between the establishment and counterculture worlds. Romeo, meanwhile, finds himself persuaded by Benvolio and their friend Mercutio to attend the same event. Not as protesters or crashers, but as invited guests. Mercutio's family, while sharing the Montague political sympathies, maintained social connections that transcended the current cultural divide. It seems like harmless adventure, a chance to see how the other half lives, to gather intelligence about their opponent's social world. Neither Romeo nor Juliet realizes that this evening will transform them from background players in their family's drama into the central figures of a tragedy that will ultimately reshape both clans' understanding of what they've been fighting for and what they stand to lose. The De Young Museum stands like a temple to culture in the heart of Golden Gate Park, its neoclassical facade glowing under strategically placed spotlights that turn the evening into something magical and theatrical. Tonight, the building transforms from a repository of art into a stage where San Francisco's social elite perform the elaborate dance of charity and networking that has sustained high society since the city's earliest days. Luxury automobiles glide up the circular driveway like a parade of wealth. Cadillac Eldorados, with their distinctive chrome bumpers, Mercedes sedans that speak of European sophistication, and the occasional Rolls-Royce that announces its owner's arrival with understated majesty. Valets in crisp uniforms move between the vehicles with practiced efficiency, while photographers capture images of prominent families for the society pages of tomorrow's Chronicle. The museum's interior has been transformed for the evening's festivities. The main gallery, usually housing ancient artifacts and contemporary paintings, now serves as a reception area where waiters in black bow ties navigate through clusters of conversation carrying silver trays laden with champagne glasses and carefully crafted canapés. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the assembled guests, creating an atmosphere that feels both intimate and grandly theatrical. Juliet enters this world wearing an ivory silk dress that falls gracefully to just below her knees, her dark hair styled in soft waves that frame her face like a classical portrait. Her mother, Elena Capulet, guides her through the social maze with the expertise of someone who has spent decades mastering the subtle art of high society navigation. Elena introduces her daughter to city council members, prominent businessmen, and society matrons whose approval serves as currency in this rarefied atmosphere. But Juliet's attention keeps drifting from these carefully choreographed conversations. Through the museum's tall windows, she can see the park beyond, where different kinds of people gather around campfires and acoustic guitars, their laughter mixing with the evening breeze. The contrast feels almost surreal. Inside, the careful formality of her family's world. Outside, the spontaneous community her heart increasingly yearns to understand. "You seem distracted tonight, darling," her mother observes during a brief moment between introductions, her voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who has built her identity around maintaining appearances. "This is an important evening for your father's business relationships. The Morrison account depends on the connections we make here tonight." Juliet nods dutiful agreement, but her eyes continue their restless survey of the room, searching for something she can't yet name. The conversations around her focus on stock portfolios, vacation homes in Carmel, and the upcoming social season, topics that feel increasingly disconnected from the real world beyond these walls. Meanwhile, at the museum's side entrance, Romeo arrives with Benvolio and Mercutio, their appearance marking them as visitors from a different cultural planet. Romeo has chosen his clothes carefully for this expedition into enemy territory. Dark jeans that have been pressed for the occasion, a white cotton shirt open at the collar, and a sport jacket borrowed from Mercutio's more conventional wardrobe. His hair, though longer than any of the other men inside would consider proper, has been combed back in a style that won't immediately identify him as part of the counterculture movement. Mercutio, whose family fortune derives from shipping interests that predate the current cultural divisions, moves through the social landscape with amused confidence. He possesses the rare ability to translate between worlds, understanding both the language of his family's establishment connections and the idealistic vocabulary of his political sympathies. "Remember," he whispers to Romeo as they accept champagne glasses from passing waiters, "we're here as observers, not revolutionaries. Think of it as anthropological research, a chance to study the habits and customs of the capitalist tribe in their natural habitat." Benvolio, less comfortable in these surroundings, stays close to his companions as they navigate through clusters of conversation. The contrast between this gathering and the communal meals he's accustomed to sharing in the Montague collective couldn't be more stark. Here, every gesture seems calculated for effect, every smile measured for its potential social or economic return. Romeo finds himself studying the faces around him, searching for signs of the humanity his family's political rhetoric often obscures. These people, his father's sworn enemies, look surprisingly ordinary when stripped of their ideological labels. They laugh at jokes, worry about their children, and seem genuinely committed to the charitable cause that brought them together tonight. The evening progresses with the measured rhythm of a well-orchestrated symphony, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. The museum's main gallery fills with the soft murmur of refined conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of cultured laughter. Waiters continue their elegant dance between guests, ensuring that champagne glasses never remain empty, and that small plates of carefully arranged hors d'oeuvres circulate, like offerings in a temple dedicated to sophisticated society. Romeo moves through this unfamiliar landscape with growing fascination rather than the hostility he expected to feel. These people, whom his father's rhetoric has painted as soulless materialists, display the same fundamental human desires for connection and meaning that drive the counterculture communities he knows so well. The difference lies not in their hearts but in their methods. Where his people seek authenticity through rejection of convention, these guests pursue fulfillment through mastery of social refinement. He pauses near a display case containing ancient Greek pottery, the red-figured vases telling stories of gods and mortals caught in eternal dramas of love and conflict. The irony isn't lost on him. Here he stands, a Montague surrounded by Capulets and their allies, studying artifacts that depict the same timeless struggles his own family is living through in contemporary San Francisco. Those pieces are from the 5th century BC, a voice says beside him, soft and melodious like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze. The stories they tell about forbidden love crossing social boundaries feel remarkably contemporary, don't you think? Romeo turns and finds himself face to face with Juliet Capulet, though neither knows the other's identity in this moment of pure human connection. She stands bathed in the warm light reflecting off the display case, her ivory dress seeming to glow with an inner luminescence that makes her appear almost ethereal. Her dark eyes carry an intelligence and depth that immediately captivates him, and when she smiles, something shifts in the very foundation of his understanding about what's possible in the world. "They do," he replies, surprised by how natural conversation feels with this stranger who should theoretically represent everything his family opposes. Maybe the same stories keep getting told because the fundamental conflicts never really change. People want to love whom they choose, but society keeps insisting on categories and boundaries. Juliet studies his face with the intensity of someone who rarely encounters authentic conversation in her carefully controlled social environment. His features carry a sensitivity that sets him apart from the aggressively conventional young men usually presented to her as suitable companions. There's something in his eyes, a depth of feeling and thought that suggests he sees beyond the surface of things to their deeper meanings. "I don't think we've met," she continues, extending her hand with the graceful formality her upbringing requires, while her heart races with something entirely ungoverned by etiquette lessons. "I'm Juliet. Are you involved in the literacy program we're supporting tonight?" "Romeo," he responds, taking her hand in a gesture that feels both formally appropriate and electrically intimate. The simple contact sends unexpected warmth through both of them, a physical recognition that precedes intellectual understanding. "I'm here with friends who believe education can change the world, though sometimes I wonder if the world really wants to be changed." Their conversation flows with the easy intimacy of old friends, reuniting after a long separation, each finding in the other a quality of attention and understanding that has been missing from their respective lives. They move unconsciously away from the crowded gallery into a quieter alcove where Renaissance paintings depict scenes of pastoral romance, their movement drawing them deeper into a private world that exists outside the social and political divisions that define their family's relationship. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Juliet asks, her voice dropping to a more intimate register as she realizes she's expressing thoughts she's never shared with anyone. "Like you're following a script written by people who never bothered to ask what you actually wanted?" Romeo feels something shift inside his chest, a recognition so profound it's almost painful. Here is someone who understands the weight of family expectations and inherited conflicts, someone who questions the assumptions that others take for granted. In her eyes, he sees reflected his own sense of being caught between loyalty and authenticity, between what he owes his family and what he owes his own heart. "Every day," he admits, stepping slightly closer as the noise of the party fades into background static. "Sometimes I think we spend so much energy fighting our parents' battles that we forget to discover who we might become if we were free to choose our own struggles." The museum around them seems to fade into soft focus as Romeo and Juliet continue their conversation, the carefully curated world of charity galas and social obligations becoming background noise to the immediate reality of their connection. They drift through the galleries like dancers following music only they can hear, pausing before paintings that seem to illuminate their growing fascination with each other. In the contemporary art wing, they stop before a massive canvas painted in swirling colors that capture the psychedelic spirit of the decade, oranges blending into purples, greens flowing into gold, the kind of abstract expressionism that divides viewers between those who see profound meaning and those who see expensive chaos. But Romeo and Juliet see something else entirely, a visual representation of the possibility that boundaries can dissolve, that separate elements can merge into something entirely new. "My father would say that painting represents everything wrong with modern culture," Juliet confesses, her voice carrying a hint of rebellious satisfaction. He believes art should depict recognizable subjects in traditional styles. Beauty should be contained, controllable, safe. "My father would probably love it," Romeo responds with gentle irony. He'd see it as liberation from conventional restrictions, proof that consciousness can expand beyond artificial limitations. "But sometimes I wonder if he's just as rigid in his rebellion as your father is in his traditionalism." The observation hangs between them with the weight of revelation. Here are two young people beginning to understand that their families' seemingly opposite worldviews might spring from the same source: fear of complexity, the need to impose simple categories on experiences that resist easy definition. As they talk, their bodies unconsciously mirror each other's movements. When Juliet tilts her head to consider a sculpture, Romeo tilts his in response. When he gestures toward a painting, she leans in to follow his sightline. The physical choreography of attraction plays out beneath their intellectual conversation, creating layers of communication that neither fully recognizes but both completely feel. The spell breaks suddenly when Mercutio appears at Romeo's shoulder, his expression shifting from amusement to alarm as he recognizes the young woman who has captured his friend's complete attention. His whispered warning cuts through Romeo's enchantment like a cold wind through summer warmth. "Romeo, do you know who you're talking to?" Mercutio's voice carries urgent concern disguised as casual conversation. "That's Juliet Capulet, Vincent Capulet's daughter, the enemy's princess, man." The words hit Romeo like a physical blow. But instead of diminishing his fascination, they intensify it with the sharp edge of impossibility. This woman, who understands his struggles with family expectations, who questions the very assumptions that fuel their parents' conflict, belongs to the other side of the cultural war that defines his daily existence. Juliet sees the change in his expression and feels her own moment of recognition approaching like a storm she can see building on the horizon but cannot avoid. When her mother appears beside them with social introductions poised on her lips, the inevitable revelation crystallizes with terrible clarity. "Juliet, darling, I'd like you to meet some of our guests." Elena Capulet begins, then stops as she recognizes the young man whose hand her daughter has been holding with unconscious intimacy. Her face goes through a rapid transformation, polite social warmth freezing into protective maternal alarm. "You're Richard Montague's son," she states rather than asks, her voice carrying the chill of someone who has just discovered a serpent in her garden party. "What are you doing here?" The question hangs in the air like a sword suspended over their newfound connection. Romeo and Juliet stand frozen in the moment between innocence and knowledge, between the pure possibility of their attraction and the complicated reality of their inherited conflict. "I was invited," Romeo responds with quiet dignity, though his eyes never leave Juliet's face. "Mercutio's family included me on their guest list. I came here tonight thinking I might learn something about the people my family considers enemies." "And what have you learned?" Elena asks. Her protective instinct. The days following the museum encounter pass like frames in a slow-motion film, each moment stretched and intensified by the weight of newfound knowledge. San Francisco awakens to a summer morning painted in shades of gold and uncertainty, the city's famous fog retreating toward the ocean like a curtain being drawn back to reveal a stage set for drama. Romeo walks through the Mission District with steps that seem to float above the cracked sidewalks, his consciousness split between the familiar reality of his neighborhood and the impossible memory of Juliet's voice, her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about art and freedom and the courage to live authentically. The murals that decorate building walls, images of Che Guevara and farm workers and brown-skinned children reaching toward painted suns, blur past him like background scenery in a dream where only one face remains in sharp focus. He stops at the corner cafe where Benvolio works the morning shift, the espresso machine hissing steam that rises like incense in the temple of counterculture community. The familiar sounds and smells should comfort him, but instead they emphasize how everything has changed since he learned that the woman who understands his soul belongs to the family his father has taught him to consider mortal enemies. "You look like someone who's seen a ghost," Benvolio observes, sliding a cup of coffee across the reclaimed wood counter. Around them, the usual morning crowd settles into their routines. Art students sketching in journals, poets scribbling verses about revolution and consciousness expansion, musicians tuning guitars for impromptu sessions that might last until sunset. "Maybe I have," Romeo replies, wrapping his hands around the ceramic mug as if its warmth might anchor him to the present moment. "Or maybe I've seen the future, and it's more complicated than anything our families prepared us for." Benvolio studies his cousin's face with the concerned attention of someone who has watched Romeo move through the world with increasing restlessness over the past months. But this morning brings something different. Not the aimless searching that has characterized Romeo's recent mood, but a focused intensity that suggests he's found what he was looking for, even if he doesn't know what to do with the discovery. Meanwhile, across the city in the refined heights of Pacific Heights, Juliet sits in her family's garden, surrounded by roses that her mother tends with the same careful attention she applies to maintaining social relationships. The flowers bloom in carefully planned colors: deep reds, pristine whites, soft pinks that complement the house's Victorian architecture and speak of tasteful prosperity. But Juliet sees none of the garden's orchestrated beauty. Her mind replays every moment of her conversation with Romeo, analyzing each word and gesture for clues about what this impossible connection might mean. She has been raised to believe that Montagues represent everything dangerous and destructive about contemporary culture. Yet the young man she met possessed a gentleness and intelligence that contradicted everything her family's rhetoric had prepared her to expect. Her nurse, Maria, approaches through the garden paths carrying a tea service on a silver tray, her dark eyes noting the distant expression that has characterized Juliet's mood since returning from the museum fundraiser. Maria has worked for the Capulet family long enough to recognize the signs of a young woman grappling with feelings that challenge the careful boundaries of her upbringing. "You seem troubled, mi niña," Maria says, setting the tray on a wrought iron table painted white to match the garden's aesthetic of controlled elegance. "Did something happen at the museum last night?" Juliet looks up from her contemplation, and Maria sees something in her expression that causes immediate concern. The bright intensity of someone who has glimpsed possibilities beyond the safe confines of family expectations. It's a look Maria remembers from her own youth, before circumstances forced her to choose security over passion, stability over the unknown adventures that call to young hearts. "I met someone," Juliet confesses, the words carrying weight far beyond their simple meaning. "Someone who made me realize how narrow my world has become. How many questions I've been afraid to ask, because I knew the answers would complicate everything." Maria settles into the chair across from Juliet, understanding that this conversation will require the careful navigation of competing loyalties. She loves this family that has employed her for nearly 2 decades, but she also remembers what it feels like to be young and constrained by other people's definitions of appropriate behavior. In the downtown offices of Capulet Development Corporation, Vincent Capulet reviews morning reports that contain increasingly troubling news about community opposition to his latest project. The Montague Collective has organized a sophisticated campaign of legal challenges and public relations efforts that threaten to delay construction indefinitely. Neighborhood groups, environmental organizations, and historic preservation societies have rallied to their cause with an effectiveness that surprises him. His assistant enters with the morning newspapers, their headlines reflecting the growing polarization of the city's political landscape. The Chronicle's front page features a photograph from yesterday's demonstration, showing Richard Montague addressing a crowd gathered in front of City Hall, his long hair and casual clothes making him look like a prophet of social change, calling followers to some new promised land. Vincent studies the image with the analytical attention of someone trying to understand an enemy's strategy. He recognizes the power of the Montagues' appeal. They offer simple answers to complex questions, promising that rejection of conventional success will somehow lead to authentic fulfillment. But he also sees the naivety in their position, the dangerous assumption that good intentions can substitute for practical experience in managing the real challenges of urban development, making her voice sharp as broken glass. Romeo looks directly at Juliet, his answer intended for her rather than her mother. "I've learned that maybe our families have been fighting the wrong war. Maybe the real enemy isn't each other but the assumptions that keep us from seeing each other as human beings." The words resonate through the small group with the force of prophecy, carrying implications that none of them are prepared to fully confront. Around them, the charity gala continues its elegant progression. Other guests unaware that in this quiet corner of the museum, the foundations of a long-standing feud are beginning to shift in ways that will ultimately transform or destroy everyone involved. Juliet feels the weight of her family's expectations pressing against her chest like a physical force, but when she looks at Romeo, she also feels something stronger. The recognition of a kindred spirit whose understanding of her inner life transcends the political categories that are supposed to define them as natural enemies. The evening that began as routine social obligation has become the first chapter of a story that will test everything both families believe about loyalty, love, and the price of choosing individual happiness over collective identity. The afternoon sun climbs higher over San Francisco, casting sharp shadows between the Victorian houses that line the steep streets of the lower HAIGHT. The air shimmers with summer heat and tension, as if the city itself can sense the growing conflict between the forces of tradition and change that use its neighborhoods as battlegrounds for competing visions of American society. In the converted warehouse that serves as headquarters for the Montague Collective, an emergency meeting unfolds with the urgency of wartime planning. Richard Montague stands before a large map of the contested development site, his finger tracing the boundaries where his family's philosophy will either triumph or face devastating defeat. Around him, Supporters ranging from college students to aging veterans of earlier social movements listen with the intensity of believers receiving scripture. The Capulets have accelerated their timeline, Richard announces, his voice carrying the weight of someone who has spent years learning to read the subtle signs of political maneuvering. Our sources at City Hall report that they're pushing for final approval at next week's council meeting. If we don't stop them now, we lose not just this battle but any hope of preserving what makes this city a sanctuary for alternative ways of living. The assembled group responds with the kind of passionate determination that has fueled social movements throughout American history. They volunteer for phone banks and letter-writing campaigns, for organizing demonstrations, and reaching out to media contacts who might amplify their message. But underneath their organized resistance flows an undercurrent of something more personal. This fight has become a symbol of whether communities built on shared ideals can survive in a world increasingly dominated by corporate interests and commercial development. Romeo sits near the back of the room, his attention divided between his father's strategic planning and the persistent memory of Juliet's voice asking whether he ever felt like he was living someone else's life. The question has haunted him since their encounter, forcing him to examine assumptions he's never previously thought to question. Meanwhile, several miles across the city in the offices of Capulet Development Corporation, Vincent Capulet conducts his own strategy session, with the cool efficiency of someone who has spent decades learning to navigate the intersection of business and politics. The conference room overlooks the financial district, its windows offering panoramic views of the glass towers that represent San Francisco's transformation from a sleepy harbor town into a major center of international commerce. His advisors spread architectural plans across the polished conference table, their discussions focusing on construction timelines and profit projections, with the precision of military planners preparing for a decisive campaign. But Vincent understands that this project represents more than financial opportunity. It symbolizes his family's right to participate in shaping the city's future according to principles of economic growth and practical progress. The opposition is more organized than we anticipated, his chief attorney reports, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviews legal documents that could potentially delay the project for months or even years. They've filed environmental impact challenges, historic preservation petitions, and community rights lawsuits. Each one has to be answered individually, and the process could extend well into next year. Vincent's jaw tightens with frustration born of someone who has spent his career learning to overcome obstacles through determination and strategic thinking. He built his fortune by understanding that success requires the ability to see beyond immediate setbacks to long-term objectives, but the Montagues campaign threatens to turn his greatest achievement into his most public failure. As the afternoon wears on, fate continues, weaving its invisible threads through the lives of young people who remain unaware that their personal choices will soon intersect with their family's public conflict in ways that will transform everyone involved. Juliet convinces Maria to accompany her on a shopping trip to Union Square, ostensibly to purchase items for her upcoming birthday celebration, but actually to escape the suffocating atmosphere of family expectations that has intensified since the museum fundraiser. The department stores of downtown San Francisco offer a neutral territory where different social classes mix without the political tensions that define neighborhood boundaries. Here, amid displays of fashion and luxury goods, Juliet hopes to find some perspective on the feelings that have been growing stronger each day since meeting Romeo. But as she moves through the crowded aisles of carefully merchandised abundance, she finds her thoughts returning obsessively to their conversation about ancient Greek pottery and the timeless nature of human conflict. Something about his understanding of art and his willingness to question inherited assumptions resonated with parts of her personality that have been dormant under years of careful social conditioning. Romeo, meanwhile, finds himself drawn to the same commercial district by restlessness he can't quite name. He walks through the crowds of afternoon shoppers with the aimless intensity of someone searching for something he can't identify, his eyes scanning faces with unconscious hope that he might encounter the one person who has made him question everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between enemy and friend. When they spot each other across the busy intersection of Powell and Market Streets, the recognition hits both of them like electric current jumping between exposed wires. The crowds of tourists and shoppers fade into background noise as they navigate through the urban maze toward a meeting neither planned but both desperately needed. The meeting happens in the shadow of the cable car turnaround at Powell and Market, where tourists gather to watch the mechanical ballet of San Francisco's most famous transportation system. The afternoon crowd provides perfect camouflage for two young people whose presence together would trigger family scandals if discovered. They move instinctively toward each other like dancers following choreography written in some language deeper than conscious thought. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again," Romeo says when they're close enough to speak without shouting over the street noise. His words carry the weight of someone who has spent days replaying a brief encounter, analyzing every gesture and phrase for hidden meanings. "I kept hoping I would," Juliet replies with honesty that surprises her. In her family's world, such directness from a young woman would be considered inappropriate, but something about Romeo's presence makes conventional social rules seem irrelevant. "I've been thinking about what you said at the museum, about fighting our parents' battles instead of discovering our own struggles." They walk together through the commercial district, their conversation resuming with the easy intimacy they discovered during their first meeting. But now their words carry additional weight, informed by the knowledge of who they are to each other's families and what their connection represents in the larger context of San Francisco's cultural war. The city around them provides a constantly changing backdrop for their developing relationship. They pass through Chinatown, where elderly men play Shang-Chi in Portsmouth Square while children chase pigeons between the benches. They climb the steep streets toward North Beach, where the aroma of garlic and fresh pasta drifts from family restaurants that have served the same recipes for 3 generations. Each neighborhood tells its own story of immigration and adaptation, of communities that have learned to maintain cultural identity while participating in the larger American experiment. The diversity surrounding them emphasizes the absurdity of their family's conflict. In a city built by people from dozens of different backgrounds, why should political philosophy create insurmountable barriers between individuals who clearly understand each other? "Sometimes I feel like I'm watching my life happen to someone else," Juliet confesses as they pause at a viewpoint overlooking the bay, where Alcatraz Island sits like a monument to the price of challenging authority. "My parents have planned everything. Which schools I'll attend, which social events I'll participate in, which young men from appropriate families I'll eventually marry. But none of their plans include asking what I actually want." Romeo feels a surge of protective anger toward people who would try to contain someone as vibrant and intelligent as Juliet within the narrow confines of social expectation. But he also recognizes the parallel constraints that shape his own life, the pressure to embody his father's ideological convictions, regardless of his personal inclinations. "My family expects me to carry on their fight," he responds, his voice carrying frustration born of someone who loves his parents but increasingly questions their methods. They see the world in such clear terms. "We represent authenticity and freedom. The Capulets represent materialism and oppression. But after meeting you, I keep wondering if maybe both sides are missing something important." Their conversation is interrupted by the appearance of Tybalt Capulet, Juliet's cousin, whose afternoon walk through the financial district has brought him face to face with a scene that confirms his worst suspicions about his family's enemies. Tybalt represents the most militant wing of the Capulet faction, a young man whose anger toward the counterculture movement stems from genuine belief that their influence threatens everything his family has worked to achieve. "Juliet, what the hell are you doing?" Tybalt's voice cuts through their intimacy like a blade, his presence transforming their private world back into the public arena, where family loyalties and political divisions define acceptable behavior. Romeo recognizes Tybalt from photographs and newspaper coverage of previous confrontations between their families, and he understands immediately that their peaceful afternoon has just become infinitely more complicated. He positions himself slightly in front of Juliet, not from any assumption that she needs protection, but from instinctive recognition that Tybalt's anger poses a threat to both of them. "I'm having a conversation with someone who treats me like an intelligent human being instead of a political symbol," Juliet replies, her voice carrying defiance that surprises all 3 of them, something I don't experience very often in our family's social circle. Tybalt's face flushes with the kind of rage that comes from someone whose worldview has just been challenged by a trusted family member. In his understanding, fraternizing with the enemy represents not just personal betrayal but a fundamental threat to everything the Capulet name represents in San Francisco's social hierarchy. The confrontation escalates quickly, drawing attention from passers-by who sense the electric tension crackling between the 3 young people. The afternoon that began with promise and possibility now carries the potential for violence that could transform a private romance into a public incident with consequences none of them can fully anticipate. The confrontation in downtown San Francisco ends as quickly as it began, but its reverberations spread through both families like shockwaves from an earthquake that threatens to bring down structures built over years of careful planning and mutual antagonism. Tybalt's discovery of Juliet's meeting with Romeo transforms what might have remained a private matter into a crisis that forces both clans to confront the fundamental question of whether family loyalty trumps individual happiness. The news reaches Vincent Capulet within hours, delivered by his nephew in terms that make the situation sound like a military intelligence briefing about enemy infiltration. Vincent sits behind his mahogany desk in the glass tower that overlooks San Francisco's financial district, his hands folded with the controlled tension of someone processing information that threatens everything he's worked to build. She was holding his hand, Tybalt reports, his voice still tight with the anger that has been simmering since the downtown encounter. Walking through the city like they were on some kind of romantic date. This isn't just teenage rebellion. It's collaboration with the enemy. Vincent stares out his office window at the city sprawling below, where fog begins its evening retreat toward the Pacific Ocean, leaving behind a landscape painted in shades of gold and shadow, the view that usually fills him with satisfaction. Concrete evidence of his rise from immigrant poverty to establishment success now seems fragile, threatened by forces he's spent decades learning to control through careful planning and strategic thinking. But Juliet's attraction to Romeo Montague represents a kind of chaos that can't be managed through business acumen or political maneuvering. It strikes at the heart of everything Vincent believes about loyalty, family identity, and the price of maintaining social position in a world where different values compete for dominance. Meanwhile, in the converted warehouse headquarters of the Montague Collective, Richard Montague receives his own version of the crisis report from followers who witnessed the downtown confrontation. Their account focuses less on romance than on political implications. The possibility that his son's involvement with a Capulet might compromise the movement's credibility at the crucial moment when their opposition to the development project needs maximum community support. People are already talking, reports one of his longtime supporters. A woman whose graying hair and lined face speak of decades spent fighting for social justice causes. They're saying Romeo might be feeding information to the other side, that maybe the whole thing is some kind of setup designed to undermine our legal challenges. Richard walks to the window overlooking the industrial landscape of the lower HAIGHT, where Victorian houses mix with warehouses and small manufacturing buildings in the kind of diverse urban ecosystem his movement fights to preserve. The late afternoon light casts everything in warm tones that make even the most mundane structures look touched with possibility, but he finds no comfort in the familiar view. He understands better than most how quickly political movements can be destroyed by internal divisions and external manipulation. The counterculture community he's helped build depends on trust and shared commitment to ideals that transcend individual desires. But his son's apparent romance with the enemy's daughter introduces variables that threaten to unravel years of careful organizing and relationship building. As evening approaches, Romeo walks through Golden Gate Park with the restless energy of someone whose inner landscape has been permanently altered by forces beyond his control. The park fills with its usual collection of evening visitors. Joggers following the winding paths, families gathering around barbecue grills, musicians settling into informal concerts that might continue until dawn. He pauses near the AIDS Memorial Grove, a quiet section of the park dedicated to remembering victims of the epidemic that has begun touching San Francisco's communities in ways that transcend political boundaries. The Grove's peaceful atmosphere provides sanctuary from the chaos that has erupted in both families since Tybalt discovered his meeting with Juliet. But even in this place of reflection, Romeo can't escape the weight of competing loyalties that threaten to tear him apart. His love for Juliet feels like the most authentic thing he's ever experienced, yet pursuing it means betraying everything his father has taught him about family solidarity and political commitment. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path breaks through his contemplation, and he turns to find Mercutio approaching, with the careful expression of someone bearing news that will complicate an already impossible situation. "Your father wants to see you," Mercutio reports, his usually jovial demeanor subdued by the gravity of family crisis. "Both families are calling emergency meetings tonight. This thing between you and Juliet has stopped being a personal matter." Romeo nods with the resignation of someone who has been expecting this moment since the downtown confrontation ended. He understands that his choice to pursue a relationship with Juliet Capulet has transformed him from a peripheral figure in his family's political drama into a central character whose actions will determine whether the long-standing feud escalates into open warfare or finds some unexpected resolution. The Montague Collective gathers in their warehouse headquarters as the San Francisco evening settles over the city like a blanket woven from fog and fading sunlight. The usual atmosphere of communal decision-making has given way to something more formal and confrontational, as if the space has been transformed from a center of creative collaboration into a courtroom where Romeo must answer for choices that threaten the movement's fundamental principles. Richard Montague stands before the assembled group with the weary authority of someone who has spent years learning to balance personal relationships with political necessities. His followers arrange themselves in a rough circle on cushions and folding chairs, their faces reflecting the kind of serious concern, usually reserved for discussions of police harassment or legal challenges that could shut down their operations entirely. "We're facing a crisis that goes beyond family loyalty," Richard begins, his voice carrying the measured tone he uses for the most difficult conversations. "Our entire movement depends on community trust and moral authority. If people believe we can be compromised by personal relationships with our political enemies, we lose everything we've worked to build." The words hit Romeo like physical blows, but he forces himself to remain standing in the center of the circle, understanding that this moment will define his relationship with his family and their cause for years to come. Around him, people he's known since childhood study his face with expressions ranging from disappointment to genuine concern for his well-being. "She's not my enemy," Romeo responds, his voice steady despite the emotional chaos churning inside him. "She's a young woman who questions the same assumptions I've been questioning, who sees beyond the categories our families use to justify their conflicts. Maybe the real betrayal would be letting political ideology prevent us from recognizing our common humanity." The statement resonates through the group like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of reaction that reveal deep divisions within the collective itself. Some nod with understanding born of their own struggles to balance individual desires with movement loyalty, while others shake their heads with the kind of disappointment reserved for those who have abandoned sacred principles for personal gratification. Simultaneously, across the city, in the refined elegance of the Capulet family mansion, a parallel scene unfolds with different staging but identical emotional intensity. Vincent Capulet paces through his home's formal living room, its Persian rugs and crystal chandeliers, providing a backdrop that speaks of generations of careful social climbing and financial success. Juliet sits in a high-backed chair that makes her look smaller and younger than her 19 years, while her mother perches on the edge of a silk-upholstered sofa with the rigid posture of someone whose world has just been threatened by forces she doesn't understand. Tybalt stands near the marble fireplace like a prosecutor preparing to deliver evidence that will convict a family traitor. "This isn't about romance," Vincent declares, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as final judgment. "This is about loyalty, about understanding that our family's success depends on maintaining clear boundaries between ourselves and people who want to destroy everything we've built." Juliet looks up at her father with eyes that seem older than they did a week ago, as if her brief taste of authentic connection has accelerated her understanding of the costs and constraints that shape adult relationships. She sees him clearly now, not as the wise patriarch she was raised to revere, but as a man so committed to protecting his version of success that he can't recognize the possibility of other valid ways to live. "What exactly have we built that's worth preserving if it prevents me from caring about someone who treats me like an intelligent human being?" she asks, her voice carrying quiet defiance that surprises everyone in the room, including herself. The question hangs in the air like a challenge to everything the Capulet family represents in San Francisco's social hierarchy. Vincent feels the ground shifting beneath assumptions he's never previously thought to examine, assumptions about family loyalty and social responsibility that have guided his decisions for decades. "You don't understand what you're risking," he responds. But his voice carries less certainty than before. The Montagues aren't just political opponents, they're dangerous radicals who want to tear down the institutions that make civilized society possible. Your association with them puts our entire family at risk. But even as he speaks, Vincent recognizes the inadequacy of his own arguments. His daughter's relationship with Romeo Montague forces him to confront the possibility that the young man might be more than the caricature his political rhetoric has created. That behind the enemy label might exist an actual person whose motivations are as complex and valid as his own. The evening deepens around both families as they grapple with questions that have no easy answers. Outside their respective gatherings, San Francisco continues its nightly transformation from business center to playground, with lights beginning to twinkle across the hills like earthbound stars. But inside the spaces where the Montagues and Capulets conduct their crisis meetings, the usual rhythms of city life feel suspended by the weight of decisions that will determine whether love can bridge political divisions, or whether family loyalty must inevitably triumph over individual happiness. The night deepens over San Francisco like a curtain falling on the first act of a tragedy, and both families reach conclusions that will force Romeo and Juliet to choose between love and loyalty in ways that will test everything they believe about themselves and their capacity to challenge inherited assumptions. In the Montague warehouse, the collective reaches its verdict with the kind of painful consensus that marks communities forced to choose between individual members and collective survival. Richard Montague delivers the decision with the heavy voice of someone whose parental love conflicts with his political responsibilities. Romeo, we can't support a relationship that undermines everything we're fighting for, he announces, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. If you continue seeing Juliet Capulet, you'll have to choose between her and your family. We can't afford to have our credibility questioned at the moment when the city council will decide the fate of our neighborhood. The ultimatum lands in the warehouse's charged atmosphere like a bomb whose explosion will reshape all their relationships. Romeo looks around the circle of faces that have defined his community since childhood, seeing in their expressions the genuine anguish of people who love him, but cannot separate personal loyalty from political necessity. You're asking me to abandon someone who represents everything our movement claims to value, Romeo responds, his voice gaining strength as he articulates thoughts that have been crystallizing since his first conversation with Juliet. She questions authority, thinks independently, refuses to accept the limitations other people try to impose on her consciousness. Isn't that exactly what we've been fighting for? Meanwhile, in the Capulet mansion, Vincent reaches his own conclusion with the ruthless efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions that affect other people's lives. The formal living room feels like a tribunal chamber, where Juliet faces judgment for crimes against family solidarity and social position. You have two choices, Vincent declares, his voice carrying the finality of someone who has spent decades learning to impose his will through financial and social pressure. You can end this foolishness immediately and marry Paris Whitman as we've planned, or you can leave this house and this family forever. I won't have the Capulet name associated with Montague radicalism. Paris Whitman represents everything Vincent admires in the younger generation. A Harvard Business School graduate whose family fortune derives from shipping interests, a young man whose political views align perfectly with establishment values, and whose social connections would strengthen the Capulet family's position in San Francisco society. Juliet receives her father's ultimatum with the strange calm that sometimes accompanies moments of complete clarity. She understands now that her choice involves more than selecting between two young men. It represents a decision about what kind of person she wants to become, and what kind of life she's willing to accept as the price of family. Approval. I need time to think, she responds, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake, reshaping her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. That night, as both families retreat to their respective corners to nurse wounds inflicted by the day's confrontations, Romeo and Juliet find ways to communicate that bypass the surveillance of relatives determined to prevent further contact. A network of mutual friends, sympathetic cafe workers, and random strangers touched by their story creates an underground railroad of messages that allows them to arrange a clandestine meeting in Golden Gate Park. They meet near the Japanese tea garden, where carefully manicured landscapes provide a haven of tranquility in the midst of urban chaos. The moon filters through eucalyptus trees, casting patterns of light and shadow that make their surroundings look like a stage set for the kind of romantic drama their families would consider dangerously naive. They want us to choose, Juliet says without preamble, understanding that they have moved beyond the luxury of casual conversation into territory where every word carries the weight of permanent consequence. Between them and each other, Romeo finishes, reaching for her hand with the desperate intensity of someone who knows he may soon lose the most important thing he's ever found. Their conversation unfolds with the urgency of condemned prisoners, planning an escape that might save or destroy them. They speak of possibilities that seem simultaneously impossible and inevitable: elopement, exile, the creation of a new life together that exists outside the boundaries their families have spent years constructing. My father controls my trust fund, my social connections, everything I've been raised to think of as security, Juliet explains, her voice carrying the weight of someone calculating the true cost of authentic freedom. If I choose you, I lose not just my family but the entire world they've created for me. And if I choose you, I lose my community, my purpose. Everything I've believed gives my life meaning. Romeo responds, understanding that their love has become a test of whether individual happiness can justify abandoning collective responsibility. But as they hold each other in the moonlit garden, surrounded by the kind of carefully planned beauty that human beings create when they want to impose order on natural chaos, both Romeo and Juliet begin to understand that some choices transcend rational calculation. Their connection represents something larger than personal desire. It embodies the possibility that different worlds can meet and merge without one destroying the other. The night around them pulses with the life of a city that has always attracted people willing to risk everything for the chance to reinvent themselves, and in that environment, their impossible love begins to seem like the most natural thing in the world. The morning of August 15th dawns over San Francisco with an ominous clarity that makes every detail of the city's landscape appear hyper-real and charged with significance. The fog that usually softens the edges of buildings and hillsides has retreated completely, leaving behind a world painted in harsh light that reveals the stark divisions between neighborhoods, between classes, between the competing visions of America that have turned this summer into a battleground for the soul of the city. At City Hall, the final confrontation over the development project unfolds in a chamber packed with supporters from both sides of the cultural divide. The Montague collective arrives in their characteristic uniform of faded denim and hand-embroidered shirts, their long hair and casual clothes marking them as representatives of the counterculture movement. They carry signs painted with slogans about community preservation and environmental protection, their faces bearing the intense determination of people who see this vote as a referendum on their right to exist in an increasingly commercialized world. The Capulet faction enters through the building's formal entrance, like an army of establishment respectability. Vincent Capulet leads them wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that costs more than most families earn in a month, his silver hair styled with the kind of precision that speaks of morning appointments at exclusive barbershops. His supporters represent San Francisco's business community, real estate developers, bank presidents, and corporate lawyers, whose understanding of progress focuses on profit margins and property values. The chamber buzzes with the tension that precedes either breakthrough or breakdown, as if the very air molecules have been charged with the electricity of impending change. City council members take their seats with the careful neutrality of politicians, who understand that this vote will define their careers and possibly determine the city's future direction. Romeo enters the chamber with his father and the Montague collective, but his attention remains divided between the political drama unfolding around him and the persistent memory of his last conversation with Juliet in the Japanese tea garden. Their midnight meeting 3 days ago ended with promises to find each other after the council vote, regardless of which side prevails in the political battle. But Romeo doesn't know that Juliet sits in the chamber's gallery, hidden among supporters of her father's development project, her presence a secret she's kept from both families since deciding that she must witness the moment when their personal crisis intersects with the larger conflict that has defined their relationship from its beginning. She watches Romeo from across the room with the intensity of someone memorizing details against an uncertain future. His profile, turned toward the speaker's podium, where various community representatives will soon present their final arguments, carries the same thoughtful seriousness she noticed during their first conversation at the museum. But now that expression seems weighted with the knowledge of everything they stand to lose. The proceedings begin with Richard Montague delivering an impassioned speech about the soul of San Francisco, his voice resonating through the chamber's formal architecture with the kind of moral authority that has made him the most effective spokesman for the counterculture movement. He speaks of neighborhoods as living organisms that cannot survive the surgical removal of their historic heart, of communities that exist not on architectural blueprints, but in the relationships between people who have chosen to create alternative ways of living together. This vote isn't just about zoning regulations or construction permits, Richard declares, his hands gesturing toward the gallery where his supporters nod with the fervor of congregants hearing familiar gospel. It's about whether San Francisco will remain a city where different kinds of people can coexist, or whether we'll surrender to the homogenizing force of corporate development that turns every neighborhood into the same profitable emptiness. Vincent Capulet responds with his own vision of urban progress, delivered with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations and investment committee meetings. He speaks of jobs and tax revenue, of the practical benefits that come from strategic development designed to strengthen the city's economic foundation. Sentimentality won't pay for schools or hospitals, Vincent argues, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has spent decades learning to translate idealistic dreams into pragmatic reality. Progress requires the courage to make difficult decisions, to choose substance over symbolism. This development project will provide opportunities for thousands of working families, not just the privileged few who can afford to treat poverty as a lifestyle choice. The debate continues for hours, each side presenting arguments that reveal fundamental disagreements about the nature of community, progress, and human happiness. But underneath the political rhetoric flows an undercurrent of something more personal, the recognition that this conflict has become a proxy war for competing definitions of what constitutes a meaningful life. As the afternoon wears on, tensions in the chamber escalate beyond the usual boundaries of civic discourse. Supporters from both sides begin interrupting speakers, their passionate convictions overwhelming the formal protocols designed to maintain order during democratic deliberation. The city council chamber erupts into chaos as the formal veneer of democratic process gives way to the raw emotions that have been building throughout the summer. What began as orderly testimony transforms into confrontation when Tybalt Capulet stands to address the council, his voice cutting through the afternoon air like a blade, designed to draw blood rather than build bridges. The Montague Collective doesn't represent authentic community values, Tybalt declares, his words aimed directly at Romeo's father with the precision of someone who has spent weeks crafting the perfect verbal attack. They're parasites feeding off the prosperity that hard-working families like mine have created through decades of legitimate business success. Their opposition to development comes not from principle but from fear that progress will expose their irrelevance. The accusation lands in the charged atmosphere like a match thrown into gasoline. Richard Montague rises from his seat with the controlled anger of someone who has spent years enduring similar attacks but has finally reached the limits of his patience. The only parasites in this room are developers who profit by destroying communities they've never taken time to understand, Richard responds, his voice carrying the moral authority that has made him the movement's most effective spokesman. Mr. Capulet talks about progress, but his definition of improvement means erasing anything that doesn't generate maximum profit for his corporate investors. The exchange escalates quickly beyond the boundaries of civic discourse, with supporters from both sides shouting accusations that reveal the depth of their mutual incomprehension. The chamber fills with voices raised in anger, passion, and fear, the sound of democracy straining under the weight of conflicts too fundamental to resolve through parliamentary procedure. Romeo watches the scene unfold with growing dismay, understanding that his family's noble ideals have become entangled with personal animosity that threatens to destroy any possibility of meaningful dialogue. Across the room, he catches glimpses of Juliet in the gallery, her face pale with the recognition that their private love story has become inseparable from this public confrontation. The moment that changes everything happens when one of the younger Montague supporters, inflamed by Tybalt's insults and energized by the mob psychology that can transform even peaceful people into agents of violence, throws a heavy glass ashtray that catches Tybalt on the side of his head with sickening force. The chamber falls silent as Tybalt staggers, blood streaming from a gash above his left ear, his expensive suit suddenly transformed into evidence of violence that will dominate tomorrow's newspaper headlines. The injury isn't life-threatening, but it carries symbolic weight that will reverberate through both families and the larger community for years to come. Security guards rush to restore order as paramedics attend to Tybalt's wound, but the damage extends far beyond physical harm. The violence transforms what might have remained a policy disagreement into a criminal matter that will involve police investigations, legal proceedings, and media coverage that paints the entire counterculture movement as dangerous and unstable. Vincent Capulet kneels beside his nephew, his face cycling through shock, rage, and cold calculation as he processes the implications of what has just occurred. This incident provides exactly the kind of evidence he needs to convince undecided city council members that the Montague Collective represents a genuine threat to public safety and social order. This is what happens when we try to negotiate with radicals. Vincent announces to the chamber, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet with the authority of someone who has just been proven catastrophically correct. They talk about peace and love, but when they don't get their way, they resort to violence against anyone who disagrees with their ideology. Romeo feels the weight of collective guilt settling on his shoulders, understanding that his family's cause has been irreparably damaged by a moment of uncontrolled anger that will be used to justify everything their opponents have claimed about the dangers of social radicalism. But more personally, he realizes that the violence has created an unbridgeable chasm between himself and Juliet. How can she love someone whose family has literally drawn blood from her family? How can their relationship survive when it must now carry the additional burden of physical violence that makes their family's conflict about more than competing philosophies? The city council meeting ends in recess as emergency personnel clear the chamber and police begin taking statements from witnesses. The development vote is postponed indefinitely while authorities investigate what the media will undoubtedly frame as domestic terrorism committed by anti-development extremists. Outside City Hall, both factions regroup in separate areas of the building's plaza, the physical distance between them, emphasizing the psychological gulf that has opened as a result of the afternoon's violence. The Montague supporters huddle together with the defensive posture of people who know they've lost not just a political battle but their moral authority in the court of public opinion. Romeo searches desperately for some glimpse of Juliet in the chaos, but she has disappeared with her family's entourage, whisked away to safety, like a valuable asset that must be protected from contamination by association with dangerous elements. As evening approaches over a city that feels fundamentally changed by the afternoon's events, Romeo walks through the Mission District with the hollow steps of someone who has watched his entire world collapse in the space of a few violent moments. The weeks following the City Hall violence pass like a fever dream of legal proceedings, media investigations, and escalating hostility that transforms San Francisco's cultural war from philosophical disagreement into something approaching actual warfare. The incident involving Tybalt becomes a rallying cry for establishment forces across the city, who use the blood on his expensive suit as evidence that the counterculture movement poses a genuine threat to civilized society. Vincent Capulet emerges as the public face of law and order, his appearances on local television news programs casting him as a reasonable businessman, forced to defend his family against dangerous radicals who resort to violence when democratic processes don't produce their desired outcomes. The development project that seemed politically doomed before the violence now gains support from city council members who fear being seen as soft on extremism. Meanwhile, the Montague Collective faces legal challenges that threaten to destroy everything Richard has spent years building. Several prominent supporters distance themselves from the movement, unwilling to risk association with an organization linked to political violence. Donations dry up, legal fees mount, and the warehouse headquarters that once buzzed with optimistic planning now feels like a bunker under siege. Romeo moves through this transformed landscape like a ghost haunting the ruins of his former life, understanding that his love for Juliet has become not just impossible but actively dangerous for everyone involved. The violence at City Hall has created a blood debt between the families that makes their relationship seem like a betrayal of Tybalt's suffering and a mockery of Vincent's legitimate grievances. But love, once awakened, proves resistant to rational calculation. Despite the impossibility of their situation, Romeo and Juliet find ways to communicate through networks of sympathetic friends who recognize something valuable in their connection, something worth preserving even as their families spiral toward mutual destruction. They arrange to meet one final time at the AIDS Memorial Grove in Golden Gate Park, the same place where Romeo first processed the magnitude of choosing between love and loyalty. The evening fog rolls in from the Pacific Ocean like nature's own curtain, softening the edges of the eucalyptus trees and creating an atmosphere of ethereal beauty that seems disconnected from the harsh realities of their family's conflict. "We can't continue this," Juliet says without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of someone who has spent sleepless nights calculating the cost of their relationship in terms of other people's suffering. "Every moment we spend together makes the situation worse for both our families." Romeo takes her hands with the desperate intensity of someone trying to hold on to the most important thing he's ever found, understanding that this conversation will determine whether love or loyalty ultimately defines the meaning of his life. "What if we left?" he asks, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we disappeared together? Created our own life somewhere far enough away that our families could heal without having to worry about our relationship complicating everything?" For a moment, the possibility hangs between them like a bridge that might carry them from the world of inherited conflict into something entirely new. They imagine themselves in other cities, other lives, free to love without the weight of family expectation and political symbolism. But the fantasy dissolves as they confront the reality of what such an escape would cost, not just themselves, but everyone they would leave behind to deal with the consequences of their choice. Their families, already wounded by violence and public humiliation, would face additional trauma from the abandonment of children they've loved despite everything. "I can't do that to them," Juliet finally admits, tears streaming down her face with the bitter taste of sacrifice that love sometimes demands of its most devoted servants. "They're wrong about many things, but they're still my family. I can't run away and leave them to carry the weight of our choice." Romeo understands, with the terrible clarity that accompanies moments of complete moral recognition, that their love has become a luxury neither can afford, while their families remain locked in destructive conflict. Their connection, no matter how authentic and transformative, cannot justify the additional pain it inflicts on people already struggling to make sense of a world that seems to be changing too rapidly for human adaptation. They hold each other in the gathering darkness, surrounded by trees that have witnessed countless human dramas of love and loss, their embrace carrying the weight of goodbye that both recognize as permanent. In choosing their families over their own happiness, they transform their love story from romance into tragedy, but also into something larger, a sacrifice that carries the seeds of eventual reconciliation. The news of their mutual decision to end their relationship reaches both families through the same informal networks that enabled their communication. But instead of relief, the announcement produces unexpected grief as parents and relatives confront the magnitude of what their conflict has cost. Not just the loss of a development project or political victory, but the destruction of something beautiful and innocent that might have shown them a different way forward. In the months that follow, both Richard Montague and Vincent Capulet find themselves changed by the recognition of what their children were willing to sacrifice for the sake of family peace. The young people who chose loyalty over love become symbols not of defeat but of the possibility that competing worldviews might coexist without mutual annihilation. The development project eventually proceeds, but with modifications that preserve some of the historic buildings the Montague collective fought to protect. A community center designed, according to environmental principles, bears a plaque dedicating it to the memory of love that transcended political boundaries. Romeo and Juliet, meanwhile, carry the weight of their sacrifice into separate futures, their brief connection serving as proof that understanding between different worlds remains possible, even when circumstances make such understanding impossible to sustain. Their story becomes part of San Francisco's folklore, a reminder that love can bridge any divide even when it cannot ultimately survive the crossing.